Right, so welcome everyone. My name is Paulius. I am the managing director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. And this is our second NoBeC Norms and Behavioral Change talk. Today's agenda is very similar to the one last week and to the one we will use in most of our talks. I will say a few words, a couple of minutes to introduce you to this series and our center. Then we will have our video from an early career researcher, this time Abraham Aldama, a postdoc at UPenn. Then at 1:15 Philadelphia time, we will have the second NoBeC talk by Professor Chris Blattman from the University of Chicago. And then we will have 15 minutes for questions. So as you maybe already know, these NoBeC talks are organized by the Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center at the University of Pennsylvania that does consulting, research, and training. Just to give you a very short example of the types of things we do, a project we have been developing for a few years now, is the longitudinal evaluation of networks and norms study in Tamil Nadu, India, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Svasti, India. And there we are working on norms around sanitation and toilet use. So we did a formative research process, a diagnosis on norms and networks. We designed an intervention, and now we are applying a randomized controlled trial based on social norms to try to increase toilet use in Tamil Nadu. You can find more information in our website that is displayed here. And that's it, just an example of the types of things that we do. This you have probably seen, it's our list of talks until August for now. This is our second, as I mentioned. We have a very nice list of speakers every 3 weeks on Thursdays at the same time. You can scan these for more information or go to the links. Oops, sorry. A few ground rules that you probably know already. You should be muted, but please keep yourself muted. If you can, please turn on your camera so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, please use the chat. We have a co-author here today, as before, that will be answering questions, and you can also use the raise hand function at the end. We're also transmitting this live on our Facebook page, and the recording of this talk will be available on our website in the next following days. So after that, I will show you the pre-recorded video of this week's early career researcher. His name is Abraham Aldama. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and his presentation is called Information about Inequality and Support for Redistribution. So I think I will go to YouTube because it works better. Yeah, so it should be here, the volume. Okay.
Good morning. Today I will be presenting a paper Information about Inequality for Redistribution, which is joint work with Christina Theory and Yana Pro. Traditional political economy models predict that in democracies, greater inequality should lead to greater taxation on the rich and to more redistribution. However, this has not been the case. The US, inequality has increased in the 1960s, and taxation has not. Although there's a number of explanations in the literature about why this might be the case. We're going to take this from the last that I listed here, which is that people might misperceive inequality. Right, so the question is whether providing more information about inequality changes preferences for distribution. So by asking this question, we address the growing literature about information and preferences for distribution. And typically this literature tells people where they are in the income distribution, or provides physical reminders of inequality, and then measures the impact of this on people's preferences for a distribution. In contrast, we're going to provide information about accumulation of income at the top 1%, at the bottom 50% of the distribution. And we're also going to provide incentives in a different treatment for people to overcome like cognitive and ideological biases for which they might be misperceiving inequality. Then we're also going to measure the impact of unchanged of these things on both perceptions of fairness and redistributive policy preferences. We recruited over 2,800 subjects on Prolific, and we're going to measure our outcomes on a 0 to 100 scale. And in our survey experiment, after measuring people's demographics, we're going to measure the outcomes first. So we're going to present people with the treatments. Then we're going to ask them to state their beliefs about how much inequality they believe there is. And then we are going to measure the outcomes again. So we're going to mostly focus on the diff and the outcomes, which are a measure of fairness of the income distribution in the US. We're also going to ask them a question about whether federal income taxes under which 1% should increase, whether government welfare should increase, whether donations to charity by the top 1% should increase, whether charity welfare assistance should be increased. And we're also going to have a behavioral measure of donation to charity, in which we ask people to state how much they would donate to a charity that helps the poor if they receive, are the winners of a lottery in which 10 respondents are selected at random. We're going to have 4 treatments. The first is a control with no information. The second, we're going to give them information about how much the bottom 50% is taking home of the total income generated in 2018. The third is going to be information about how much the top 1% is taking home in 2018. And the fourth is this monetary incentive, in which for each answer that respondents give within 5 percentage points of the true proportions of how much the top 1% and the bottom 50% are taking home, you're going to pay an additional $1. So what are our results? So when we provide people with information about how much the top 1% is taking home, we see that there is a significant reduction in their belief of how much they believe the top 1% is taking home. But when we provide information about how much the bottom 50%, or when we give them incentives to overcome their cognitive and ideological biases, we see that they believe that the top 1% is taking more than in the control condition. Now, similarly, when we measure people's beliefs about how much the bottom 50% is taking home, we find that when we provide information about how much the top 1% is taking home, people suddenly state that they believe that the bottom 50% is taking much more home. And when we provide information about how much the bottom 50% is actually taking home, or when we give them these monetary incentives to overcome their biases, we see that there is a reduction in how much they believe the bottom 50% is taking home. So basically, when we provide information about how much the bottom 50% is taking home, or when we're giving these monetary incentives, people believe that there is more inequality, whereas when we provide them information about how much 1% is taking home, they believe that there is less inequality. So what impact does this have on our main outcomes? Well, we find that there is no impact, right? If we look at the diff and diff, which is highlighted in gray in this table, the effect of the treatments on changes in perceptions of fairness, desire for taxation and aid, and donations to charity by the rich and spending by charities is basically unaffected. We also find that there is basically no effect on people's willingness to donate to charity, both at the intensive and the extensive margin, right? So, and then we further analyze whether different subpopulations might be actually responding different to the treatments, and across a number of different covariates that we believe by reading the literature might have an effect on how people react to these treatments, but we find that the effect is still that there is no impact on changes in people's redistributive preferences. So basically, what do we find? That information about inequality and incentives to overcome biases changes people's perception of how much inequality there actually is. And however, these treatments have a limited effect, at least in our sample, on people's perception of how fair inequality is and on their redistributive policy preferences. And it basically, the bottom line being that preferences for distribution are hard to change just with information alone and with monetary incentives. Thank you so much. It's been great to present to you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
All right. Yes, I will. So that was our video. I will return to the presentations. Sorry for the sound issues. We are still figuring out the best way to do this with the videos. Yeah, so that was Abraham Aldama with his presentation. If you have any questions, comments, ideas for him, you can contact him in his Twitter account that is displayed here, or scan this code or go to his personal webpage. So thanks a lot, Abraham, for that. Right, and two small reminders before we begin. If you would like to have a chance to have your video featured in our next talk, which is in the 11th of March, and you are an early career researcher, of course, please submit it before March 7th. That's in 2 weeks. We will still accept applications for other talks afterwards. We are doing this in a rolling basis, so you can also apply afterwards. Of course, as soon as early as you can apply, you will have more chances to be featured. And the second reminder, our next talk in 3 weeks will be with Professor Marie-Claire Villeval on norm formation and endogenous information acquisition. If you already registered, you don't need to register again. We will remind you of the talk. And if you haven't registered, you can go to the usual websites. So having said this, I will introduce Enrique Patas, who is a member of our center and a distinguished fellow here at UPenn, and he will be the moderator for today.
Excellent. So I will be moderating the seminar. Welcome to this second talk. Before I briefly introduce Chris and Santiago to you, let me just remind you of the rules. If you want to make any question, please use the chat. During Chris's presentation, I will be making a selection, and then I will give you the chance. If I find the question for whatever reason interesting enough, I will interrupt Chris, and then I will give you the chance to make the question. By the end of the talk, depending on the number of questions, either I will be making the selection, or you will be able to just raise your hand and make the question yourself directly. So we are pleased and honored to have not one author, but two authors. Today we have Chris Blattman and Santiago Tobon presenting this paper. Chris Blattman is the Roman Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, and he's also the chair of the Peace and Recovery Sector at IPA and the chair of the Crime, Violence, and Conflict Initiative at JPAL. He has worked with victims, perpetrators of crime and violence. He has worked on finding solutions to violence and poverty, and the poverty-violence link in many places, including Liberia, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Colombia. And he will be talking about Colombia today. And he has published his work in journals like APSR, American Political Science Review, American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and so on. And there is a book coming soon, Why We Fight. Hopefully it will be available soon. And Santiago Tobon, who will be taking questions in the chat, is a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Research in Economics and Finance at the University of in Medellin, Colombia. And he has published his work in journals like the Review of Economics and Statistics or the Journal of the European Economic Association. So Chris, welcome. Thank you again. And the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Santiago, why don't I have you introduce yourself? I mean, and explain how you'll take questions while I just get my screen up and share my screen.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and thanks, everyone and the organizers for allowing us to present our work here. So I'll be just taking questions in the chat. I'll leave some probably for Enrique to just give them to Chris. We'll do our best, because many times we get so many questions that we just can answer some of them. But thanks again in advance for all your reactions to this work. It's been a long time, like 4 years. Now, Chris, you can go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for everybody for coming. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and Enrique, great to see you again. Wish I could be there in person, but then we wouldn't have this big global audience. So what you see here is a picture of, this is Medellin. Medellin is if you don't know it, it's a middle income, almost high income city in some sense. It's got a tremendously capable state, lots of revenues, lots of social services. In many ways, it's a state that functions extremely well. And so it's interesting that and important that in basically every low and middle income neighborhood in the city, and you can see as you move up the mountainsides on either side, you'll see that these are generally poor and poorer settlements. Now, all of these places are formalized. They have power, they have roads, they have water, they have formal land title and so forth. All of these have been incorporated into the state and receive a lot of services. At the same time, if a neighbor is encroaching on your property, if you need to evict a tenant, if somebody is shoplifting from your store, if somebody is hassling your daughter on the street, you may call the police, you may call a member of the city's security service, which is a civilian apparatus, or you'll call the combo, okay? And the combo is the name given to a local gang. And essentially every square inch of the city, except for downtown, I would say every square inch of the residential neighborhoods of the city, excluding downtown, excluding the major commercial districts, and excluding the richest neighborhoods, every square inch is controlled by a combo. And everyone knows the borders, and most people know who the combo is and who the members are, and they will turn to them very frequently to solve these problems. Okay, so here what you see is a map of Medellin running from north to south. The river runs down its center, and highlighted in color is the income level of the city. So you have the poor, the lighter the color, the poorer the neighborhood. And these are all of the low and middle income neighborhoods. So excluded here in white are both the rich neighborhoods and also put non-residential neighborhoods. And the dots is our estimated location of one of the roughly 300 combos within Medellin itself. And to the continuous urban sprawl that goes north and south, the Itajuí and Bello above, there's probably another 50 in those municipalities as well. And they've been there for decades. They have well-defined borders. What you see here are administrative borders of the city, which differ from the combos borders. And we have borders for some of the combos. We don't have a comprehensive set of borders for all of these combos, in part because these are clandestine organizations. And most people, including the city government, don't really have a good understanding of who these combos are, how they operate, and why. Okay, and when you think of a combo, you sort of have to hold two images on your head. Like, on one hand, most of them are groups of about 15 to 50 young men, most of them in their teens and their 20s, some in their 30s, who, this I think comes from one of their Facebook pages or something, and you might think, oh, it looks like a bunch of disorganized hooligans, but it's seldom the case. There's a whole leadership structure and hierarchy. Sometimes the leaders are in their 20s or 30s. Often nowadays they're much older, and you can see Santiago. I'm taking the picture. You can see Santiago interviewing one of these leaders of one of the most organized combos in the city. So organized, they built this craft center for kids behind them, the recycling center they built behind that. They produce yogurt and sell yogurt. And they got a USAID grant to build a community pool, which is just over to the side. Now, USAID didn't know that this NGO is actually the combo as well, but that goes to show like the extremity to which these groups can be organized. These ones being maybe some of the best organized in the city. What am I going to try to communicate today? Well, the bottom line, I'm just going to give you right away in one slide, and then we'll go through the details, is you have to think of gangs as strategic actors, that anything the state or any other actor does to try to crowd them out of whatever space they're operating in, whether it's a business or whether it's ruling civilians, they're going to react, and they're going to react in sometimes surprising ways if we don't really understand their root incentives. So why do gangs, what are we going to argue? Why do gangs rule citizens? Well, it is a business line. They make money from it. They're selling protection. But they value it. There's some intrinsic rewards to it, such as status, but they're also doing it strategically in order to defend their other business lines. It basically helps them protect their drug retail business in particular from the police and other actors by building civilian loyalty, and also just by reducing the need for the state to come around. And therefore, while we often think of gang rule as a sign of state weakness, it's actually in many ways a response to a strong state. And it's a response to a strong state because a gang only has its illicit economies when states are able to prohibit certain businesses like retail drugs, but also because the gangs need to rule and need to cultivate civilian loyalty in order to protect themselves from the state. And therefore, it's actually very hard to crowd gangs out of governing. Cracking down or better state governance are actually potentially going to increase gang incentives to rule. And we're going to show you exactly how that rule happened in Medellin. Now, it doesn't mean these policies backfire. It's the fact that there are crackdowns and the fact that they have to compete with the state that probably keeps the gangs from being extractive, that the state competition disciplines the gangs. And so they have to cultivate civilian loyalty and trust. And if the state weren't putting up such a fight, then we'd probably see them extorting rather than taxing. And we'd see them being coercive rather than providing public goods and private goods. And so, so far, none of this has anything to do with social norms. I've done some work on violence and norms, but I will get to norms at the very end, and in a way that isn't even is very appropriate. We'll talk about how we actually think some of the policy paths going forward are actually norm change is a very powerful tool that hasn't been explored in this space. So I'm going to try to do a lot in time. So I'm going to move fast often, and I'll blur through some of the technical details. And at times, and people who want to go into those can look at the paper. A big chunk of what we do is just figuring out how things work. And so a lot of it, I'll just talk to you about what data we collected and how we learned about how this whole system works. Because criminal governance is extremely common. You'll see it in Rio and Sao Paulo. You'll see it in El Salvador. You can see it in the US prison systems here in Illinois, in California, in Texas. You have seen it in the past in certain American cities. You've seen it in Sicily. You've seen it. It's a very common phenomenon, but it's not always well understood. So we're going to document it. And then we're going to sort of propose a theoretical model that I'm not going to talk much about today. People who are interested in that can go to the paper. I'll talk about our empirical work, both a quasi-experiment and as well as what we think is the first field experiment ever run at a gang level, and the results of that. So how do we know a lot of what we know? Well, Santiago and I stumbled upon this idea of researching these combos and trying to understand them more than 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago. But we didn't really know where to begin. Santiago, having worked in the security apparatus of the government and having studied crime during his PhD and having run field experiments in Medellin, will be the first to tell you that he really didn't have a deep appreciation of how these worked. And he overlooked them to some degree, even though they're such a fundamental part of the landscape. And I think that's been very true in the past of most people working in crime and security policy and a lot of government officials in the city. It's just a hazy understanding. So we began seeking out contacts. First, we found it possible to speak to senior leaders in prison. They have special wings with usually 50 to 100 leaders of criminal organizations in most of the prisons. And so we began looking for volunteers to talk to us. I'd happily, discuss if people have questions just about the ethical reviews and the considerations and the legal things we sort of ran through to make this possible were enormous. But have really paid off. We've also begun to develop contacts outside of prison. One of our main research assistants was a gang outreach worker for many years, and for a decade before that, he was a gang leader. And he reformed himself and was doing outreach work, and he turns out to be one of those gifted qualitative researchers we've ever worked with. We took on two collaborators, Ben Lessing and Gustavo both ethnographers of gangs in order to be able to do this. And so what you're going to see is the result of interviews with about 70 leaders and about 30 groups. I would say leaders and middle-ranking members, as well as a whole host of experts and state staff and community members and leaders themselves. So what are these gangs governing? Well, here's a survey. So after all our quality work, we sort of realized that most of the services that concentrate on are basically a form of selling protection. It may be helping them control disorder on the street. They may be helping to control disorder on the street. They may be preventing crime. They may be responding to crimes. And they may be helping enforce contracts like debts. And so what we did is we have 17 questions where we asked, we interviewed almost 5,000 people in the city in a representative survey about a year and a bit ago in order to sort of understand patterns across the city. And for all of these different things, from someone who's making noise to someone refusing to pay a debt, we asked how frequently the state intervenes. So on a scale of 0 to 1, you can think of, I think 0.3 is a sometimes and a 0.6 is often. And so you're sort of getting a little bit more than sometimes is the state intervening in in these 17 things. The average of all 17 is this 0.41. The combo responds a little bit less than average in the average neighborhood, all right? And sorry, a little bit less than the state in the average neighborhood. They have an average index of about 0.33. They're most likely to respond relative to the state for things like street disorder and debt collection, but people are turning both to the state authorities and to the combo to solve those kinds of problems. Then we create this measure, which we call relative state governance, right? Which is the difference between these two things. And so the average neighborhood in the city, relative state governance measure is positive, meaning the state is slightly more likely to intervene or more frequently intervene. But there are a host of things where the combo is either very competitive in terms of its frequency of intervening or intervenes even more. And this is particularly true with things like street disorder and debt collection. Okay, but these averages conceal a lot of variation, right? So if we go to these administrative units, the barrios, where you saw income levels before, now each barrio's color represents its relative state governance index. And so anything in sort of a pinkish to a red hue is a neighborhood where the combo tends to govern or respond more frequently than the state. And so all of these neighborhoods are ones where there's a combo. You can see them in the dots. So this is all essentially combo territory. The combos are governing to some degree here, but essentially they're choosing to provide these protection services in some neighborhoods and not in others. And there's a tremendous amount of variation. They also enjoy a fair amount of legitimacy. So we also asked, we didn't just ask about this combo governance index, which runs from 0 to 1 and has that average of about 0.33, but we asked civilians about whether they trust the combo, whether they think the combo ought to be providing these services, whether they're satisfied, and a whole host of things that we assemble into a legitimacy index. And you can see that, not surprisingly, combo has higher legitimacy when they govern more. But also their legitimacy levels are also reasonably high, all right? If I were to show you another plot where I plotted combo legitimacy against state legitimacy, you'd see relatively similar levels of legitimacy, all right? So the state has slightly more legitimacy than the combo, but not in all neighborhoods. So why would gangs rule? So on the one hand, as I've mentioned, protection is the service that can be sold, and non-state groups can compete in this market to sell it. And so there's essentially a duopoly of protection, providing in each locality, there's a single combo and there's a state provider. Now, in reality, there's also other non-state providers. There's community leaders and things, and we're abstracting away a little bit from that. In part, though, the combo has been very effective when it's strong at capturing a lot of those community governing institutions as well. There's a big literature looking at essentially tracing criminal governments to vacuums of state power, which is certainly true. And there's another bigger literature on how rebels rule. And also, in some sense, they rule in places where the state is also weakest. And so there's certainly something to this. And this sort of led us to believe that it would actually be possible for states to crowd out gang rule. It's consistent with standard models of duopolistic competition. Essentially, if I'm the state and say my marginal cost of providing governance services goes down, the natural strategic response of the other firm, in this case the gang, to selling this good is to actually reduce the quantity it sells. I can essentially outcompete. And it's sort of and that duopolistic competition thinking is what led us to believe that over the long run, the state would be able to crowd out gang rule. And what we identify in Medellin is that's certainly true, all right? But we identify the second countervailing force that I already sort of spoke about in brief, that essentially is going to run against that. And it may run against it only to sort of moderate the extent to which the state can crowd out gang rule, right? So it'll push back and it makes it harder to crowd out gang rule, but the state will still outcompete. And I think fundamentally that's potentially true for a strong enough state intervention. But if that countervailing force is strong enough, then actually you could actually see reversal. And that's what we sort of what we demonstrate with a formal model in the paper, that state efforts to crowd out gangs could backfire so sufficiently that actually a state's effort to increase its projection of power and its services might actually crowd out the gang. It might actually get the gang to jump in. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the data we have on motives. And just to be clear, I have until what's 1 o'clock my time, 2 o'clock your time. Is that right? Perfect. Okay. So you need to think about these services as a market and a business line, which can be a purely public good in the sense of something that's not rival and not excludable, that a state can provide, say, security in a community, and it can't deny that security to some people. That's certainly true to an extent, but there's a lot of things that are excludable about protection and security. I can choose to give security to some streets and not others. I can give more security to some businesses and not others. And I can direct that either to people who are paying for it or people whose loyalty I need in return for, right? They're sometimes paying in currency. It's called a vacuna, which literally means a vaccine. It's a weekly payment of maybe a couple of dollars per business. Sometimes it's called a security fee, a pago por la vigilancia, and these are partly fees for service, but they're partly, you can almost think of as subscriptions to Combo's protection or taxes on the blocks where they provide security, okay? And you can see the Combo has certain comparative advantages. When we ask businesses and residents, how fast are these different agents? Well, the Combo is much speedier because they're right there, and they're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The city government, this vast security apparatus, the thousands of civilian security officials, these street level bureaucrats who do a lot of everyday management of disputes and solving of problems, not only are they only working business hours and on business days, but they basically shut down every year for about a month or two through December and January, because most of them are contract staff, and there's these quirks of budgeting in Medellin are such that everybody gets fired basically for 2 months every year. And so there's this big gap in December and January in governance that certainly doesn't help. The police is around 24 hours a day, but they're outnumbered about, 10 to 1 by Combo members, just in terms of the physical number of officers on the street. And so it's not surprising that the Combos are faster. They're at least as easy to contact, if not certainly much easier than the mayoralty. But people, and then, we're sort of interested. It's hard to know what exactly to make of this question, but we sort of say, would your neighborhood be better off without the Combos? And only just under half of people will say yes. Now,
yes. I think, yes. There is an interesting question from the audience from Paul Schaffer. Paul, yep. Could you please make the question?
Yes. So my question was if the competition from the state disciplines the Combos, is there also the reverse where the state is disciplined by the Combos? And could there be something like contestable markets, even though like the Combo is no longer there, the threat still could discipline the state?
So you're saying, has the state been captured by the Combos, was your question?
No, sorry. It's like the threat of Combo rule.
Yep.
Is also an incentive for the state to provide better services.
True, absolutely, yes. And that's, so the Combo, exactly, competition in loyalties and government is potentially an incentive for the state. I would say the state probably does not necessarily have the same need for loyalty as the combo in the same way. So the state certainly wants legitimacy. My guess is that because if you go to other cities where the state is, where there aren't, this is the only city with this level of organized crime in Colombia. You have a lot of smaller, slightly less organized gangs in Cali, and there's not a significant amount of organized crime in Bogota as far as we can tell. This is something we're just starting because there's some hints of maybe these slightly more disorganized youth gangs. And I would say the state services are quite strong there. So I don't think the state has quite the same sort of strategic response as the combo, but to an element, yes.
Great, thank you.
So in addition to this revenue motive or profit motive, which is real, interviews with the gang leaders and the middle managers speak to a couple of other motives. One is this idea of this basically of gang rule and selling protection having positive externalities on other business lines, other illicit rents, especially retail drug sales. So one leader tells us how the community shields you according to your behavior. If you do not have the community in your hands and your back, you do not have anything. That is what takes care of you. Another says caring for the neighbors gives the criminal more security. When the community feels comfortable and grateful, they lend their houses so that if you need to hide from the police, the community is going to welcome you. The community goes out to defend you. So you're a clandestine group, and you're in some sense, your protective factor is the fact that the police and the state don't know where to find you or don't have evidence of your activities. And so if people are willing to denounce you, this is a fundamental threat to your own personal freedom as well as the profits of your business. And so you want to cultivate the loyalty of these people so that they collaborate with you against the police. And you can go online, and every so often there's a video that's circulated where the police are trying to arrest a combo leader, and the community comes out to block the house and defend him, right? And that's the extreme. That's in some sense what you're shooting for if you've decided to take this strategy. But the same leader also, the person I just quoted, added, also, there's a good relationship with the people, and it's easier to bring order in the sector, and so the police do not have to come around. So it's not just about cultivating loyalty, it's just giving people fewer need to phone and call one of these patrols or call a specialized unit or call a specialized city service into the neighborhood, which at minimum might just scare away clients to your drug corner. But it might also increase the probability of arrest, or it may also increase the probability that whoever comes uses their coercive power to shake you down rather than arrest you. And because this is somewhat common, right? The police are relatively professionalized and all things considered, do a fairly good job. But at the same time, this is just such a big moneymaker, and they're so outnumbered by these combos that they either have no choice but to collaborate, or this tremendous incentive to take bribes. There's another set of interviews, including in one case this same leader, who also says personally also doing good work feels good. You can be the worst bandit, but you can also have a good heart of your own. And at the combo level, we benefit because the neighbors take care of us. So yes, there's a strategic benefit, but I have to get up in the morning and feel like a good person just like everybody else. And this is true of every rebel or criminal leader I've ever spoken to in my entire career. Everybody has to think they're a good person, and they tell themselves a story about how they're a moral actor. It's often about taking care of their group or taking care of their boys or taking care of their community. And they like that status, and they like that, both that self-respect, but the respect that they're also afforded from other people. So another says, I was always good with the community. No one from the community can say I did something to them. I always took care of them based on principles of helping them. Or a community leader sort of saying, well, they were the founders of the neighborhood, so they care about everything being quiet. They say it's their neighborhood and they want everyone to live well. So this points to sort of an intrinsic desire for civilian loyalty, not civilian loyalty for a strategic purpose, that too, but because the loyalty and respect and the legitimacy is intrinsically valuable, right? And that's going to add to this countervailing force as we illustrate in our model. Okay, so I'm going to turn just to in the last sort of 20 minutes to mostly focus on our empirical results. Just to give you like a intuitive sense of what we are, of what the model sort of gives you is I've already given you, I think, a little bit of that detail, which is in a normal duopoly, if one firm, in this case, the state, is providing more protection for some exogenous reason, so their cost of providing that protection might go down, or they may have they themselves have this other intrinsic benefit, which we call loyalty or legitimacy, that leads them to want to be the monopolist of protection and the monopolist of governing in the city. And if they have that, and as a result, they increase their quantity supplied, then the optimal amount the other firm, in this case, the gang, should offer is generally going to go down. All right. And so there's going to be this essentially like an inverse relationship between these two things. But once you add in these intrinsic and these strategic benefits, it's not always possible that the opposite is true. It may be, as I mentioned, that it's simply the case that state protection increasing is maybe less effective, crowds out gang governance less effectively than normal, but still crowds it out. But if these intrinsic and strategic benefits are long enough, particularly if they have increasing returns to these intrinsic and strategic benefits, then it's possible that the opposite is true. And that's something we show more formally in the paper. So what dominates is an empirical question. And we went into this both with a quasi-experiment and an experiment expecting the state was able to crowd out the gangs. And as I've already indicated, we're going to find that the opposite is true. All right. And you see your first hints just in the raw correlations. So each dot here is a barrio, and each dot represents sort of where a community lies on the combo governance and the state governance index, where what we've done is we've partialed out all of the other things we can observe. So we have essentially run a regression of combo governance and state governance on all sorts of geographic characteristics like elevation and steepness, and all sorts of demographic and economic characteristics like income levels and so forth. And so we're basically then plotting the residuals, the things that are not explained about combo and state governance. And we still see this positive relationship. And our assumption was like, well, when we do our quasi-experiment or when we do our experiment, this is probably confounded by things we don't observe. This is why we do quasi-experimental and experimental work, because we don't believe these kinds of confounded correlations, but we're actually going to find out that this relationship tends to persist. And so what you get is the variation in governance in the city is coming from places that have more of both kind of rule and more of both kind of governance, and places that are not very well ruled at all, rather than places where the state tends to rule versus the combo, right? Instead you're just going to have well-governed and poorly governed places overall from both actors. Okay, first, our quasi-experiment. So what do? Well, we say, listen, in 1987, the city took Medellin and it created a new set of internal borders, and it created 16 comunas. Okay, there's also a set of more rural corregimientos out here on either side. We're gonna ignore those. They're not very populous. Some of them do have combos. We're gonna focus on the urban comunas. We have, and so these internal borders make no difference whatsoever for some kinds of state services. So if there's a school in this comuna here, and you live in this comuna, you're still eligible to go to that school. And likewise, if there's a hospital here and you live in another comuna, you're still eligible to go to that hospital. But there's a whole set of services, most importantly, most of the city's protection services that are delivered by comuna. And so beginning in 1987, these police stations, which you can see as black triangles, and these casas de justicia, which are their justice houses, they're basically a local headquarters, both for the city's dispute resolution providers, but also for family services and another set of municipal services, a lot of which have to do with combating disorder and solving problems for community members. And so these two community, and each dot here is a block where we collected data, where we have about 5 or 6 people per block. The gray ones are further, the red ones are within 200 meters of a border. Okay, and so we limit our analysis to the blocks within 200 meters of a border. And here, 2 very geographically close blocks, they're going to be very, very similar, identical on most characteristics. And the only thing that's different about them is that one of them for 30 years has been further on average from its local providers of protection than the one on the other side. And everything else, as we can show you, sort of nothing else changes discontinuously at the border. They're the same distance from business agglomerations, or the same distance from rich neighborhoods, the same difference from downtown, the same difference from schools, the same distance from all other sorts of things. And they look very similarly in a lot of their covariates. And the only thing that's different and that changes at the border is essentially proximity to the state. And there's quite a big difference. This is a histogram of the differences in the proximity of these paired blocks on either side of a border. And you can see that at the median, they're almost half a kilometer. One is almost half a kilometer more distant from the state than the other. So this is a strong treatment in the sense that this is kind of saying, well, crossing that border makes you on average almost half a kilometer more distant from the state. And so what we're going to do is in some sense very simple. We're going to take the difference in relative state governance or some other measure today. We're going to look at like basically how much do they report state or combo governance differently in those two pairs, in that pair of two blocks. And we're going to sort of see how it correlates with the difference in distance to the local state, this measure, which is going to be different for every pair of blocks. And it's on average about half a kilometer. And then to control for any possible confounding, we're going to try to control for any other differences between those two blocks in the pair. Their distance from all sorts of other services, their other covariates, how they might be geographically different, how their initial income levels were different. We're going to have a fixed effect for the borders, and then we're going to control for the fact that there are differential distances from the border, right? Some of these, this guy might be more distant from the border than his pair. And so we'll control for that as well. And all sorts of standard things to do in these border discontinuity experiments or quasi-experiments. I'm just going to brush past in the time, high level result, I'll show you a detailed table in a moment, is essentially, okay, not surprisingly, what happens when you get a half kilometer closer to the state services? Well, both state and combo governance rise. So not surprisingly, as you get about half kilometer closer, you report the frequency with which you report state governance intervening or the state intervening, either the police or the mayor's office, goes up about 20%. But the same happens for combo. You also report about a 20% increase in combo responsiveness and the frequency with which they intervene. You also see legitimacy rising, all right? Although it's not significant for the combo, it's only significant for the state. And for those of you who are interested and sort of in the paper, we sort of talk about we go into enumerable robustness checks. We try to test for measurement error correlated with treatment. We look at a host of other outcomes. In particular, we're interested in saying, well, actually, there's actually one of the things that comes out in the model, but also conceptually a lot of sense, is actually there's another reason other than the combo strategic response that when the state increases rule over a long period of time, the combo increases rule. And that's because if ruling creates positive economic growth, basically, protection is about facilitating and enforcing transactions and contracts. And if there's more economic activity or more social activity, there's more transactions in everyday life. And then it's almost like the demand curve can shift outwards for protection services because of economic and social development. And so it could be, in theory, the state could actually govern more exogenously with its Comuna strategy, and we get this exogenous difference, and then there's more demand for governance in general, and combo governance rises because of that, not because of the strategic factor. It would still be a treatment effect. It would still be well identified, but it would be wrapped up in here. This 19% response would be some proportion of that is this like response to an increase in demand. And we see a little bit of evidence of that. So there's, their income level, according to one administrative data set, doesn't really correlate with the change in state distance. It goes up, it is correlated with getting further from the state. You have slightly more poverty, you have slightly less profitable businesses, you have a slightly higher unemployment rate, you have a slightly lower schooling rate, you don't get much more population dense. I could show you a bunch of demographic characteristics. There isn't a lot of sorting. So there's probably something to this economic development story that explains a little part of this response, but we think the bulk of this response is arguably coming from the strategic response by combos. Okay, just gonna, in the interest of time, just gonna speed along and say, we said, well, this was plausible, but we are always a little bit, and this is great because it gives us this 30-year time frame, but we also, you know, we can't be 100% confident in a quasi-experiment. It also sort of, we'd also like to sort of see whether or not this could work going forward. And we stumbled upon a small intervention in a neighborhood called La Loma, which you can see here. And in La Loma, which has a population of about 10,000, so it's quite a big territory, about 6 people from a small unit within the city government about 5 years before had chosen to go into this neighborhood and basically just try to be street level bureaucrats, just govern well. They weren't trying to crowd out the combo, but they were trying to provide a lot of facilitative and somewhat protection services and basically to raise the profile and the legitimacy of the state. And so they basically they would try to solve problems for people. And so we're walking around with this guy and he's calling to this, you know, abuela on her doorstep and saying, oh, you know, did you make it to the clinic last week? Did my friend pick you up? Or and they'll call into someone else. So when, you know, I connected you to that dispute resolution office. Did they call you back? And how's that going? And he's not just solving problems himself, he's connecting them to this incredible amount of social services that exist at the city level, but that people aren't connected to, all right? And that's why they call this position a liaison, all right? And qualitatively, this seemed to work. And so we went to the mayor and the secretary of the security, and we said, look, you have a really promising intervention that you're already doing. It's not coercive. It probably isn't going to increase violence, which is a big risk of a lot of your anti-gang interventions. And so why don't you try scaling it up? And so they said, okay, well, we could probably hire about 40 liaisons. And so we picked 40 neighborhoods, each one about 1,000 to 2,000 people. And we picked 80 and half of them were assigned to receive one of the 40 liaisons that the city thought they'd be able to hire and get moving on short notice. And for the next 20 months, these liaisons were there 3 or 4 days a week. Other times they're in the office, you know, another day a week, maybe in the office and running around the city government, trying to make things happen. And they are doing a couple of things. They are going around and doing what these other liaisons are doing, trying to identify problems and not necessarily just to solve them themselves, but either to create community-based organizations that will solve those problems collectively or connect them to an organization in the city government who will solve that problem. And they're evaluated on having they have a quota of a certain number of referrals they have to make to municipal agencies or to something at the mayor's, the office of the mayor's level, which is a committee that tries to make sure that these communities get governed well. So if a call comes up and says the playground equipment's broken, the streetlight's broken, the garbage pickup isn't happening, then they try to make sure that the government is just doing its basic job in these 40 places. And so it's an experiment in saying, what if the city governed well in these 40 little communities? What's going to happen? And symbolically, what was very important is they held something called a caravana in the neighborhoods. And so all the municipal agencies come and there's food and music for 3 days, and all of the municipal agencies have a booth with representatives and they talk about their services. And so, and it's important for generating knowledge of what's available, but most importantly, it's like the first time the city's ever really said, you know, we're here to serve you. And we care about this neighborhood. That just hasn't happened before. There were some neighborhoods where this liaison would show up, or we would show up even prior, and they would say, you know, no one from the city's ever come by. You guys are the first people we've ever seen. And so they really were underserved neighborhoods. So it was somewhat of a surprise that 20 months later, we find that relative state governance is lower in the treated neighborhoods, and combo governance is slightly higher. Now, the numbers are very small. Let me jump to a table, right? But let's just say, so remember the state governance index in the whole city was about 0.41. It's the same in our 40 control sectors. So they're very similar to other parts. And people are actually reporting in the treated neighborhoods lower state governance. Now, it's not particularly robust, but it's the opposite of the direction we predicted. And again, combo governance levels are pretty similar, and they're reporting slightly higher combo governance. Again, not statistically significant, but in the opposite direction. And the difference between those two things, relative state governance, right, which is barely positive in a lot of these communities, is actually lower in the treatment communities after 20 months of very intensive face-to-face street bureaucrats and services. State legitimacy is up a little bit. And so, so what's going on here? Well, I have a limited amount of time. There's essentially sort of 4 candidate explanations. And the summary is we think that the evidence is strongest for the first and the third. So one is this combo strategic response. All right, this positive increase in state legitimacy, but a relative decline in the actual, relative frequency of who intervenes is consistent with a combo's strategic response. Okay, and so we think that's probably, or the early beginnings of a combo response. It's also possible that basically the combos are not as threatened by the state staff, the civilian staff, as they would be by policing. It might have been actually that we'd have seen a much larger, this is actually maybe smaller than otherwise, because this wasn't a policing intervention. And had this been a policing intervention, we might actually see, it might have backfired even worse in some sense. What a lot of our evidence points to is the difficulty of just increasing state capacity in the short run, so actually delivering, but then actually increasing awareness, such that after 2 years, if you grab a random person off the street in this neighborhood, which is what we did, have they had enough time to update their beliefs about the state? I mean, the state has also had enough time to sort of deliver on this capacity. And our sense is actually that it might be, we might need this 30-year, we might need 30 years of intervention before we begin to see those effects. But the 30-year quasi-experiment is sort of, this is already pointing in the direction of that, right? In this worrisome direction that suggests that, yes, we need more time, but with more time, we'd see more of a combo strategic response. We also see some partial non-compliance in some of the neighborhoods, people report more sort of failures of the liaison or failures of the state. In the places that were most governed, the places that had the highest combo baseline governance have more failures. But even if we focus on the places with fewer failures, we get almost the same result. And we show you that in the paper. So we get something very similar to this, even in the places where it was done well, which is why we sort of favor this combination of these two interpretations. Okay, so just in my last minute or two, what are sort of some general conclusions, and then what does this mean for policy? I'd be happy to talk about that more in questions. So security fees and extortion and vacunas are not the main reason that gangs decide to rule. It's a useful revenue, but their direct profit motive is overshadowed by these positive effects that ruling has on their other business lines, as well as their own esteem and respect and things that they intrinsically value as basically being a big man in the neighborhood. And so this is just going to make it hard for governments to crowd out gangs simply by striving to govern better. It's also going to make it very hard to try to crowd them out of ruling through crackdowns. Both of these strategies could backfire. It also points to, like just the difficulty and how slow and difficult it is to sort of for gangs and the state to increase their capacity to govern and then also generate a return in terms of legitimacy and loyalty. It's sort of slow and costly to stay up. And our experiment sort of points to the practical difficulties of making headway. It's a generational problem to solve and not one that can be done in a couple of years. So things that might fail to crowd out gang rule include hotspots policing, making it anything that actually makes it more difficult to collect extortion, denouncing extorters, or facilitating collective action among merchants not to pay, both of which have been used successfully in other places to reduce the vacunas. It's possible to reduce the vacunas, but they're probably still going to rule because they still need to elicit that loyalty. They might reduce the quantity they provide a bit, but in general, because they were already doing this below cost to some degree because of these externalities for their other business lines. We think that if you really want to reduce their incentives to rule, either one has to go out, reduce their profitability in these other business lines. That could be legalization of certain drugs like marijuana. It could be giving them a huge negative demand shock by treating addicts, who are easily their biggest market. We also think that, you know, the reasons that civilians give loyalty to gangs can be manipulated potentially. Would it be possible to have a social norms marketing campaign that would basically draw red lines around what gangs can and can't do? For example, not recruiting children or not selling drugs to children, or not selling some of the worst and most addictive kinds of drugs, and convincing community members that gangs that do that don't deserve their loyalty. You might actually be able to use this gang need for loyalty as a weapon against them in order to reduce some of the most socially harmful behaviors. And this is something which we're starting to discuss and may start to experiment with the city over the next couple of years. But the warning is any success one has in reducing the profitability of gangs or their need for civilian loyalty is going to lead those gangs to be more violent and more extractive. All right, and so there's a real difficult trade-off in public policy here that you know, elected governments are going to have to make. So I will leave it at that, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. You can, just enormous amount of work went into this, both from our partners and funders, and also from an enormous team. And so I also want to acknowledge them for a moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. We have plenty of questions. Diego Gambetta raised his hand first. Diego, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kike. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good. Thank you very much for very, very interesting talk. If I put it in contrast with what I know about Sicily, there are things that I find really striking. Namely, what about conflict? Conflict between combos and conflict between combos and police in terms of how and what to rule. Say, in Sicily, no equivalent of combo would let the police in any form, would punish people that approach the police and wouldn't accept any intervention whatsoever. So they would seek and to establish a monopoly, whereas the duopoly is amazing. The other thing is, how about combos would fight for territories, or at least some of the time would be in conflict, but you didn't mention conflict, so I just wanted to know about duopoly versus monopoly and who rules over the combos.
So that's interesting. So on the first, I think so. On the first, I would say another example of one where I wouldn't quite call it a monopoly, but one that drifts more in a monopoly for the be certain favelas in Rio. I believe if my co-author Ben Lessing was here, he'd be able to talk about this and much more accurately and eloquently. I think so. We see like a tremendous Mika Suriachi and some of her work in El Salvador. They see a degree of monopoly in the neighborhoods that they control. So I think this is I think this is an opportunity for, I think gangs maybe have that option. It's potentially a very costly option depending on the state's strategic response to that. And I would speculate that in Medellin, there's very few, I would think that would create a strong enough, the state has enough desire for legitimacy and is sufficiently not captured by the gangs that would generate an extremely strong amount of public outrage and strategic and police response, and so it wouldn't be allowed to happen. A good example is in Bogota. There was a little, what was that territory? What were those 3 or 4 streets called? We visited Santiago that where the police weren't allowed to go.
The Bronx.
The Bronx, right? How did I forget? And when as soon as that happened, the government came in and then cleared them out very quickly. All right, so it may be that that's just a strategic choice by it's because of the preferences of the state. On the second question, I have a slightly better or more an answer that I know we can give a much more confident answer. It's I didn't talk about it partly because it's going to be the subject of a different paper, but you have almost 350, 400 armed groups with very valuable territory. Why aren't they fighting all the time? And there's two answers to that. All right. And we not only have a paper, this is also partly the subject of my book. Generally, it's inefficient to fight. The two combos, if one has an incentive and an ability to inflict pain on the other, they can usually use that as a bargaining chip to gain some sort of tribute or gain some piece of territory rather than fight. And so there's generally an incentive to negotiate rather than fight. But of course, there's all sorts of reasons why that negotiations would break down. And there have indeed been times in the past in Medellin where it's become the most violent place on the planet. And that's when the combos go to war. And what they have to manage that is sometimes called El Pacto Fusil, the Pact of the Machine Gun. And the Pact of the Machine Gun is enforced by 15 to 17, depending on how you want to count them, organizations called razones, or reasons. And so there's maybe 300 combos with 8 to 12,000 men throughout the city, but there's about 15 razones. Each one has about 30 members. You can think of them as mafia-like organizations, and they're engaged in a lot of the same businesses like extortion and drugs, but they're extorting from big businesses and construction sites, and their drugs, they're the wholesaler to the combo retail seller. And so each razón has a whole bunch of affiliated combos. They're generally autonomous firms with separate leadership. There's no career path between them, but they have sort of a long run market and sort of political relationship with the razón. And the razón not only supplies their drugs, but it also negotiates peace amongst neighboring combos who are often members of the same confederation. And then when there's a conflict with or a dispute with a combo that belongs to another razón, they will negotiate that bilaterally, or they have this collective bodies, some of which, one of the names for them is La Oficina. And so and when this breaks down, the city becomes extremely violent. And for the last almost 10 years, this is actually held, and the murder rate in Medellin is lower than here in Chicago.
Okay, so the next question comes from Lucas Reinhardt. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering how strong the intrinsic motive is to be the strongest guy around from the combos. So can you say something about the strength of this motive, or can you disentangle the indirect motives and the intrinsic motives?
I'd say not at all. I don't think we have quite enough data, nor the kind of data to be able to say. I'm not sure what you think, Santiago. I would say my sense is the strategic response dominates the personal incentives, but I don't know that we also haven't spoken to a large enough sample of them.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's very hard to identify this sort of mechanism. So this mostly comes from interviews. But yes, I mean, I'm not sure whether I can add more to that. I think that's just our idea of what's going on, which is consistent with the results that we observe in both evaluations. It's also consistent, for instance, that, the state creates some sort of expectations. For instance, in the experiment, the state creates some expectations, then the state is not able to actually deliver, and people just goes back to the combos. That's also consistent with what we see. But from the qualitative work, they seem to value a lot having the police out. And for instance, and I'm not sure whether, Chris, you elaborated on this because I was answering questions. But in particular, with the police, most gangs have an agreement with the patrols that cover their territory, right? But whenever there's violence or something else that happens, then there's another unit from the police that comes here, and also other branches from the city government. So these are the ones of which the gangs seem to be most afraid of. And these are the ones from which the gangs seem to be trying to protect more by just keeping the territory quiet. Also, there's another territory, like the one where R6 is there. That's a razón called Los Triana. That's perhaps the poorest area of the city. The strongest gang, the strongest razón controls that territory, which is Los Triana, or one of the strongest ones. One that actually has vertically integrated all their combos. And the homicide rate there is the lowest in the city, along with the richest area in Medellin. And this is mostly, and this comes from the interviews, because they want to keep the attention out of their neighborhood, because they just want to keep their business running. So I guess this is as far as we can go.
Okay, there was a very interesting question in the chat from Brit Spiru about the difference between, Santiago addressed this question, but that was probably good for the audience. The distinction between comuna borders and combo borders. I don't know if Brit wants to elaborate a little bit on that.
Hi, I was just thinking that this was a very interesting approach that you'd used with the distance measurement to be able to look at the scale of influence. And how it was created, it was very much measuring the impact on the state because it was a state border, and how this would change if you looked at the borders relating to the combos, because this is the area that you're trying to manipulate and address their level of behavior. I just thought it was a very interesting approach to use the distance metric from the border to see what that influence was and see if combos were a better way to address that. But I understand it would be very difficult to understand these borders.
It's actually a great point. So two things on that. It does really, it's something we're actually actively working on. So one thing is that this comuna border is generally not the combo border. You know, idiosyncratically, some combo borders will stop at the comuna border, but generally not. They kind of ignore the administrative boundaries. So what that means is for any given pair of blocks, we don't generally know for sure, but for a given pair of blocks, they're probably in the same combo. And so this differential response in terms of not just state governance, but combo governance is a within combo effect, which means that the combo is the same combo is choosing to provide security strategically to some blocks and not others within its own territory based on where it faces competition from the state. Now, we don't know that for sure, you know, and if we could disaggregate that, maybe we'd see a 40% response in the between combo and none in the within. So we don't really know, but our sense is it has to be mechanically mostly driven by within combo variation, which is super interesting. Then when you mentioned sort of, we don't know you know, we've been able to trace out, we have really good contacts in this part of the city. And so we really understand the borders well for the individual combos, and mapping that for all of them is almost an impossible task. But we do have a degree of confidence in these Razón borders. And now there's fewer Razón borders than there are combo borders, and even to some extent than there are comuna borders, but this is actually something which we're planning to do, is actually, can we run the same borders as continuity based on your distance from the Razón headquarters? So we're not sure, I'm not confident that the Razón headquarters is, and the proximity to the Razón headquarters is as meaningful a distance as the distance from the police headquarters. But it might be, and we're going to be able to investigate that. But first, there's just a bunch of things we have to nail down, and that analysis isn't done yet.
Okay, so one last question, please be short, from Gianluca Grimalda, who has a couple of issues on the way you build the legitimacy and governance indexes. Gianluca.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, this is a fantastic research, but if one wanted to play the devil's advocate, could maybe have two concerns. So the fact that the first is that we know that in surveys, the opinions can always be linked to one another. So I was wondering whether you have asked questions about legitimacy and governance, let's say within subject, or if you tried to apply some experimental manipulation, like changing the order with which you ask about one or the other, or maybe even if you had some between subject effect in which you ask, between subject approach in which you ask one group only about one either state or combo, yep, and vice versa. And the second point has to do, I mean, do you think, can you really be sure that participants really revealed truthfully their opinions, or do you think that you might have come across as informants for either police or combo people?
Great, no, perfect question. So I have a better answer to the second part than the first part. The first part, we don't have that variation, as I recall, primarily because we wanted to build a level of comfortability with the questions before getting into the combo. And so we sort of talk about these 17 or these things, that all these forms of governance, and we sort of say, okay, first let's talk about the police. when this happens, how often the police don't, and we go through all of them. Okay, now let's talk about the alcaldía. And then we go through, and they're like, okay, now los muchachos. And everybody knows what los muchachos means, right? And we spent a long time just figuring out what word to use. And then we go through the same things. We're very nonchalant, like it's not a big deal. And we're doing it inside, we have a whole style that we developed to try to develop trust. And we think, and so we don't have a lot of variation in that because we just felt that it was really effective at getting better answers in a qualitative sense. And one piece of evidence for that is that the city's extortion rate, when it asks people in its official surveys, is like, I don't know, like a few percent. And ours is about 4 or 5 times that. All right, so we're getting a much higher rate of people admitting. But are they admitting the truth? Couple things we can say about that. So the first thing we can do is we actually did run a survey experiment where some people are asked, we thought maybe the one that people were the most hesitant to talk about is, did you pay a vacuna? And so we decided to play with that one and use that to sort of see whether or not there's measurement error and whether or not that measurement error is correlated with our treatment status. And so what we did is some people were said, did you pay vacuna and how much? And some people, we did a list experiment, which is where which frankly, I think was just too noisy to work. And so I don't report it here, but we basically get the same result. The survey experiment that worked really well is some people do something called randomized response, where they have to flip a coin and privately. And if it's heads, they tell us the truth. And if it's false, they're told us to not tell us the truth. Okay, and we experimented with that. And often for sensitive questions, there's a lot of evidence that randomized response gets you a much higher rate of the sensitive behavior. And what you can see is that when businesses report extortion, it's a little bit higher with the randomized response, but not much. And it's the opposite actually with households. And if we correlate, and the difference between direct response and random response by each measure is uncorrelated with combo governance, and it's also uncorrelated with our treatment. So that's one piece of evidence that we think people are honestly reporting. Some people were able to pass. We kind of thought that like the 5 or 10% of people who refuse to answer the combo questions might be systematically related to combo governance and state governance. And what we can see is like the percent of questions you pass on in these sensitive questions about combo governance and legitimacy is sort of constant and uncorrelated with levels of combo governance and state governance. So that's not proof that we don't see any measurement error or underreporting or things, but again, it's kind of a confidence building correlation.
Okay, so I'm going to give the chance, I know we are over time, but I'm going to give the chance to Diego Gambetta, who is interested in making a last question. So Diego, please be as brief as you can.
Thank you, that's very kind. I just asked by mistake Santiago instead of everyone. It was meant for Santiago, but everyone could have listened. I just asked whether specific combos are related to specific razzones, whether the organization is of that kind. And from the map, I would say yes. And also Santiago answered yes. So every combo responds or is protected by and works for a specific razzone. So my tentative conclusion was that it's at the level of razzones that you can make a comparison with the organization of the Sicilian mafia, and that combos are sort of proletarians of the situation. And I sort of have a feeling that they may have played up the protection role directly. But if the razzones were not there, giving their brand, they would find it hard to function as you have brilliantly described.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably correct. This is actually in some ways the subject you're setting up very nicely. The paper we haven't finished writing yet, but is in some sense the next come out of this work is we call it the industrial organization of this system, where it's partly about their business relationships and partly about the sort of political role that the razzones play. So when we talk about criminal governance here, I've been focusing today just on how these combos, these micro-level criminal organizations govern society, right? That's a really, but there's a whole other dimension of criminal governance, which is how these meso-level criminal organizations govern micro-level criminal organizations. So in Chicago, we call these like mobs and street gangs, and these would be the super gangs, right? And actually, the black gangsters were founded 2 blocks that way, and the Black Pea Stones were founded 5 blocks that way. The Black Pea Stones are still there. The Black Gangsters headquarters is now where I get my organic vegetables. But there was, for a very long time, this meso-micro level of criminal governance in Chicago. And you find this in Brazil, right? The PCC and the Comando Vermelho and so forth. So you find this relationship, and this criminal governance is universal almost. Sometimes they're tightly integrated, right? Like Los Triana. Maybe in Brazil, I think they're pretty tightly integrated such that you don't even notice the micro-level organizations. Then a lot of communities these are separate organizations with long-run relational contracts in Medellin. This criminal governance is not necessarily as common. It's in some cities, not others. Not all gangs in all cities have incentives to rule. It's generally not been true. You don't see this in Chicago very much. But you do see it in the prison system in the United States. So there's a lot of dimensions, and that's in some sense, so I think we're gonna look forward to some comments on our next paper from you, Diego, because that's where I think you're gonna really see some parallels to and interesting contrast to what's going on in Sicily.
Thank you. We're looking forward to reading that.
Well, me too, because it'll mean I've done it.
Okay, I believe we are way over time. Thank you very much, Chris and Santiago, for this fantastic presentation and great work. And I believe we are, and thank you all for being here and for the very interesting questions you raised. So that's at the end of the seminar. I believe Paulius maybe is willing to just close it, or any announcement?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And yeah, we hope to see you in 3 weeks with our next talk at the same time, the same link and password. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Chris and Santiago, for the talk, and thank you for organising.